Hello, everyone. I'm Elaine Ayala with the San Antonio Express News. Welcome to the San Antonio Book Festival's panel on The Real Reasons America is Divided. It's not just politics. Author Alec MacGillis and Tom Philpott have written two sobering books, one about the impact Amazon is having on our country and the other about the impending collapse of U.S. agriculture. Both illustrated a country that's ailing and fracturing. It's part of a greater pattern. For some time now, we've seen how divided we are politically, but does that fully explain our divisions and partisanship? What are other reasons, perhaps more pervasive than politics, that divide us? First, introductions. Alec MacGillis, senior investigative reporter for ProPublica, is author of Fulfillment: Winning and Losing in One-Click America. He has worked for the Washington Post, or he's written for the Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun, the New Republic, and the Atlantic, among others. His new book has been called an essential read. It's not just an expose of an omnipresent company, Amazon, but a literary investigation of a nation that falls within that company's growing shadow, where winner and loser cities and regions are drifting apart, while civic fabric has unraveled and work has become increasingly rudimentary and isolated. Journalist and former farmer Tom Philpott has been a food and agriculture writer for Mother Jones since 2011 and has written about food and food politics for the environmental website Grist and for the New York Times, Newsweek, and The Guardian. His book, Perilous Bounty: The Looming Collapse of American Farming and How We Can Prevent It, has been called unsettling. It warns that the two main sources of food production are in danger. California's Central Valley faces drought and dwindling water supplies, and the Midwest Corn Belt faces soil erosion. Fellow writer Barry Estabrook says Perilous Bounty is, quote, a must-read for anyone who eats and hopes to continue to do so. So, ladies and gentlemen, between the two of them, they're absolutely no fun. But this next hour promises to be informative and sobering. I'll ask a few questions, and then they'll take questions from you too. Welcome, Tom and Alec. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I've asked our authors to treat us to short readings from their books. So I'll start with the Amazon book. Let's go, Alex.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Elaine, and thanks to the festival for hosting us, and thanks to Tom for joining me. Really glad to be part of this. I'm glad to be part of this partly because my book does include a very key chapter set in Texas, and it's a chapter of the book where I look at the effect that Amazon is having on small businesses around the country. All these businesses that have been sort of feeling pressure to join the marketplace, as they call their site for third-party sellers, which has become a hugely important part of the company. More than half the sales in Amazon are now on the website are now done through the marketplace, through these third-party sellers, and it's incredibly lucrative for Amazon because they get a really big cut of those sales, a much bigger profit than they would get just from selling goods regularly on the site the way they used to. But so there's incredible pressure on small businesses to join the marketplace, and this chapter gets at that pressure through some office supply companies in El Paso, essentially kind of like the Dunder Mifflins of El Paso, just like the TV show, small businesses that sell office supplies to local schools and governments and businesses, and are now coming under incredible pressure from Amazon to join the marketplace, where they're going to have to essentially pay the middleman on Amazon a big cut. So this is how the chapter starts, by introducing some of the very charismatic small business owners in El Paso who are going up against the Goliath. The chapter is called Service, the Fight for Local Business. Teresa Gandara's father ran a small grocery in South El Paso. It was close to the border and a natural first stop for many of those who'd come across illicitly. Edmundo Rojas installed 2 washers and 2 dryers in the grocery and 3 showers. For a quarter, you could get a bar of soap and a towel. If this was an act of solidarity, it was solidarity at some remove. The Rojas family had come across the river ages ago further back than anyone could recall. For Edmundo, it was simply the decent thing to do. Quote, he believed everyone deserved a shower to feel clean, said his daughter. Gandara had 7 siblings, and there wasn't much to go around, but there was little sense of deprivation among the kids, at least not until they got to high school and found out they weren't wearing the right kind of jeans. Among the goods the family rationed was higher education. Teresa's older sister, Rosa, was deemed college material, but not Teresa. Determined to prove her parents wrong, she started taking community college courses in Tacoma, Washington, where she went to live with Rosa and her Army captain husband for a while, and then kept taking classes on her return to El Paso, even if it meant having to forge her parents' signature on the Pell Grant application. My first federal offense, she joked later. She took as many classes at the University of Texas at El Paso as she could fit alongside her jobs, managing the UTEP pool, painting houses, cleaning houses. She finally got the degree years later, along with a master's, by which point she was working as a physical education teacher and married to Carlos Gandara, who worked in the office supply business in a warehouse. At school, Teresa insisted on teaching kids sports they might not be exposed to otherwise, like tennis and lacrosse. I'll never teach you basketball, she told them. You can play that on your own time. And she insisted on taking 1 day a week to give classroom instruction based on sports they were playing, measuring the area of playing fields, that sort of thing. Eventually, she was promoted to assistant principal, but she didn't care for administration. She was chided once for spending too much time helping a group of at-risk students and shirking record-keeping duties. By 2000, Carlos had moved out of the office supply warehouse that he started cleaning as a teenager and held virtually every role at the company, inside sales, outside sales, management. The company had been sold and he'd been under a non-compete clause for a couple of years. When it expired, he started looking around for a new place to work, but Teresa had another idea. Why do us Mexicans think we always have to work for somebody, she said. Nobody cares about customers like you do. I'd rather invest in us. We don't know about business, Carlos said. So we fail, she said. There's only failure in not trying. We have an opportunity to try. In 2001, they launched Pencil Cup office products. Teresa held on to her assistant principal job, funneling as much of her salary as possible into the business and working on weekends. Carlos ran things during the week. The owner of an industrial machinery shop let them use space in his warehouse. Their son, Carlos Jr., 13 at the time, helped out after school. They had 3 customers at first, an accountant, an industrial supply company, and the YWCA. By 2006, they had reached the point where Teresa could quit her job. By 2010, they'd grown to 18 employees. These included Carlos Jr., who had become one of their top salesmen and who, for exercise, liked to drag around the big chain in the storeroom that was attached to the crane that had been used to hoist engines out of the buses and trams stored there when it was a repair shop. And their daughter, Christina, who had gone to New Mexico State for her new business degree, swore she wouldn't come back, but then changed her mind. Dad, you paid for my degree, she said. Let's put it to work. A growing share of their business, at least a third, was with city government and with school districts, who gave preference to buying from vendors certified as local and woman and minority owned, which Pencil Cup was. But those certifications alone couldn't explain the success. Teresa and Carlos Sr. chalked it up to their borderline dogmatic embrace of customer service. They always assembled any furniture for customers. You never received a chair or desk in a box from Pencil Cup. They made the rounds of their customers to pick up empty cardboard boxes and toner cartridges to take to recycling. And they went out of their way to help customers in tight spots. One time, a school district forgot to include 800 highlighters in an order and called at 8 a.m. to say it needed them that day. The Gandaras and their employees scoured the big box office supply stores, their rivals, for as many highlighters as they could find, even if they cost more there than from their wholesaler. Another time, a border patrol manager called to say she had bought 5,000 AA batteries instead of 5,000 AAAs, as she was supposed to. She was worried she might lose her job, and she had bought them from someone other than Pencil Cup. No matter. They bought 5,000 AAAs from their supplier and swapped them out with hers, even if it came at a loss. That's our customer, Carlos Sr. said. We're saving her job. In 2017, Gandara got a call from Amazon, inviting Pencil Cup to sell through the website, which would give it a much larger marketplace, the whole world. She knew that her business was appealing to Amazon because it could be touted for its minority-owned status, which many buyers looked for. But she couldn't help being flattered anyway. At first, we were so excited. Oh, Amazon, she said. And then we started asking the questions. Thank you.
Wow. Since the Amazon union vote is so fresh in people's minds, Alec, I'd love to start there and ask what it means that workers rejected union membership and those protections and maybe their own self-interest. What does that mean for consumers and Amazon's future and the rest of us?
I think it's going to take a little while for us to really gauge the implications and what it means for future organizing. I'm a little bit torn on this. I think on the one hand, it's definitely a setback, and there's some real second guessing going on now about the decision to go ahead with this election on the union's part, because it was definitely going to be a long shot to begin with. There were a lot of reasons that the odds were stacked against them there. For one thing, this has been kind of overlooked, but the company was very adept at greatly expanding the pool of this election of this unit. Initially, they had support among a certain number of workers to start a union there, but then the company basically expanded out the pool of voters, of eligible voters, hugely to include a lot of supervisory types and whatnot, which made it harder for the union to get a majority. So there's some question of whether they should have so pressed ahead with the election as they did. So on the one hand, it's a setback for sure. On the other hand, I can see this actually possibly being a first step toward, if not future union elections, then at least future agitation against the company, because the election did expose quite a bit of more and highlighted more of the really high pressure, unpleasant work practices at the warehouses, and just generally, I think has sort of fed into a new level of scrutiny for the company coming off of this incredible year where they just grew so much as we all kind of turned to the full e-commerce kind of habits. So it's definitely a setback, but I think it's too early to say that it necessarily will come to naught.
Okay, Tom, we'd love to hear you read now.
All right, well, thank you so much, Elaine and Alec. I can't wait to read your book. And I also have to say that I grew up in Austin and lived there off and on for a lot of my life. And San Antonio is my favorite city in Texas.
Well, come on over. Character. We'd love to have you. We'd love to have you.
Definitely. I will, as soon as this pandemic ends, I will definitely be walking the river walk and doing other amazing San Antonio activities. And so, thinking about the theme of this panel, I think one of the ways that my book fits into it is that industrial agriculture, this sort of giant, big agriculture system that we set up in this country. One of the things that it does is it turns out to be an engine for depopulating rural areas and turning rural work into a very, very cheap, including very skilled rural work. Farm work is skilled labor, meat packing is skilled labor, and turning these occupations into very low wage occupations, even while the countryside is depopulated and small towns wither, small cities turn into towns, and you get this sort of steady depopulation. And the people left behind, I think, have been very vulnerable and prone to the kind of right-wing populism that we've seen in this country over the past half decade or so. So I'm going to read from my book, chapter 4, which is just a page or two of chapter 4, which is called Empire of Dirt. And it starts in the sort of, this chapter focuses on the heart of U.S. industrial agriculture, which is based in Iowa. So I write, the first time I set foot on Iowa's famously rich topsoil, I expected a quaint rural landscape, given that farmland stretches over 90% of the state's territory. But my points of reference misled me. I had lived on a tiny farm amid the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina for 4 years. The 10 years before that, I lived in Mexico City and New York City. I didn't know from vast fields and wide horizons. Instead, I found myself barreling down the highway, surrounded on all sides by seas of green corn and soybean plants. As I passed row after row, marking my progress by that little hypnotic line that forms as your eye picks up the gap between them, I thought, what a triumph of high technology. White settlers fleeing the already overexploited East Coast showed up in what is now Iowa in the 1850s and found marshlands and prairie with hundreds of species of perennial wild grasses and legumes. Flowers towered over the newcomers' heads, their roots plunging just as deep into the earth, burying carbon snatched from the atmosphere. Vast herds of bisons ate their way through meadows, stimulating new plant growth and recycling nutrients through their manure. Native American peoples played an active role in managing the ecosystem. They periodically set fires that quickly freed nutrients and prevented trees from establishing, allowing prairie plants to thrive without being shaded out. These interactions among people, plants, animals, and climate left behind a majestic store of loamy, fertile topsoil. From that to this in 150 years, trillions upon trillions of plants from just two species packed as close together as city commuters on the subway at rush hour, but much more orderly. Just 0.1% of Iowa's tallgrass prairie remains today. As for that gorgeous cache of topsoil that was fed by and supported the prairie, the state has surrendered fully 1/2 and counting of it on average since being subjected to the plow. In California, which is the other big subject to my book, in California, American capitalism has turned a region with robust water resources and a Mediterranean climate into essentially a massive fruit and vegetable factory and pushed this rare ecosystem well beyond its natural limits. As the state's spectacular droughts, floods, and fires stalk one part of the food supply, a more subtle but equally devastating ecological crisis has taken root in our other key node of food production, the Northwest. Touchdown in the region on a midsummer day, and what you will see looks nothing like an ecosystem in a state of unraveling. Rather, you'll be confronted with the spectacle of almost unfathomable bounty. On a summer day now, a vast carpet of corn and soybeans stretches to the horizon in all directions. If you look closely enough through the seas of bright green corn and deep green soybeans, you might see off-color misfits poking up here or there, weeds that have evolved to resist the annual cascade of herbicides. Otherwise, plant species that aren't corn and soybeans are rare, unless you count the forlorn prairie grass remnants that line the roadside, awaiting the mower's blade. On my first visit to this landscape, these fields struck me as the most impressive and brutal example I had ever seen of humanity's will to reorder landscapes to its whim. As impressive as a Manhattan skyline, or the view of the valley occupied by Mexico City that you get from an airplane. And then it goes on.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, for those who haven't read your book yet, tell us how you see the futures of California's Central Valley and the Midwest's Corn Belt, and how they can or can't continue to produce our food.
Well, I mean, as I lay out in the book, there's a lot of momentum and a lot of profit and a lot of economic interest behind the status quo in both those places. And if those forces continue without some pretty serious change, pretty soon, I think we're looking at a pretty dire future for those areas. And, in California, the main limiting factor of the area is water. And basically the state's agricultural system has dramatically, I think, outstripped the water resources available to it. And as a result, what you get is this sort of race to the bottom of the aquifer in the Central Valley. And partly that is going to be mitigated by a law they put into effect back in 2014 that is eventually supposed to force every one of the watersheds in that area to come into balance, to stop taking out more water than then comes back naturally. And if that law actually plays out, we're going to see a pretty big reduction in fruit and vegetable production in California. And, the other factor that's haunting the state is that climate change just exacerbates this problem, because the sort of renewable water resource, which is the snow melt of the Sierra Nevada mountains, is shrinking. It's, we've already seen the past 20 years a dramatic reduction of it. The state is actually probably entering another drought right now as we speak. And so that renewable resource is being, dissipated by climate change. And so this situation where we can count on going into the supermarket and seeing this bounty of fruits and vegetables from California, that's going to change pretty soon because of these natural factors and the law. And we'll see if these economic interests are able to push back against that, which they're trying to do. And so that's where we get our fruits and vegetables. And the Midwest is really the corn and soybeans that I was just talking about. That drives the system that gives us our meat. When you walk into the supermarket, the bounty of meat that you see on display there is because of those corn and soybeans. And what's happening in Iowa is that soil is eroding at a dramatically fast pace, way faster than it's being reproduced. And these giant corporations that control the meat packing trade, we read a lot about during the pandemic because of the way they're abusing their workers. They have an interest in continuing things as they are now. The companies that sell their fertilizers and pesticides and genetically modified seeds, this tiny handful of companies, they benefit and profit from it. And so whereas in California, we're in a race to the bottom of the aquifer, in the Midwest, we are at a fairly crucial stage of the race to the bottom of the topsoil layer. And so unless things change really fast, I see this, basically ecological decline that's going to start hitting us, at the supermarket where it's going to hurt the most.
Okay, I have more questions for both of you, but let me jump back to Alec. I have to ask you about No Man Land, the Oscar-nominated film that in which the Amazon warehouse serves as a backdrop to the whole movie and left the viewer with a look at U.S. workers in crisis and the United States in crisis too, if not merely divided, but depressed and sort of post-capitalist. What did you see in it and in the future of a country of haves and have-nots? I couldn't help but almost see Russia as I saw those workers in the warehouse.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's a very powerful film, and I wrote a short piece for the LA Times just a week or two ago about the film, and actually about the book also on which the film is based, which has the same title, a book by Jessica Bruder. And what I actually wrote about in that piece was that in fact the depiction of, I found the depiction of Amazon notably more benign than what you see in Jessica Bruder's book.
Interesting.
As kind of as impersonal and kind of bleak as the warehouse work looks in the film, it's actually far more favorably portrayed than in the book. In the book, there's far more details about workers really, kind of suffering on the job and being under extraordinary stress to ramp up their production and really kind of hating the job. Whereas in the film, it's almost this thing that they kind of return to again and again to make some money and then head back out, and just something they do. It's almost like a kind of a homecoming when she comes back there, for another holiday season that will work there. In general, though, I mean, I think, what both the film and the book show is this reality now, which is that, and it's even more so after this past year, where Amazon warehouse work has become, in a way, the sort of the new form of mass, sort of new mass work option for a whole swath of the American working class, whether it's these semi-retirees who are traveling around the country in their campers, or whether it's just the more typical worker looking for a job. The company's grown so much. I mean, just 400,000 additional workers hired in the U.S. just this past year.
Wow.
I mean, it's hard for us even to grasp. 50% more warehouse space, 40% more sales. This on top of what was already an enormous base before the pandemic. And that's why something like the Amazon, the Alabama union vote matters so much, and future similar battles will matter so much, because what Amazon work now looks like, whether we can lift it up in some way, lift up the work in the warehouse to make it somewhat better paid, somewhat less grueling, somewhat more sustainable. Right now, there's almost typically about 100% turnover at a lot of these warehouses because the work is so taxing and so just not something that you want to stick with for a long time. If we want to make work, entry-level work for the great mass of Americans pay better and be more fulfilling, you have to address the Amazon warehouse, because that really is now where a sizable share of Americans are going for work. It's kind of become the new factory job that you could just go to get, to work for a time, make some money, except that it doesn't pay as well as the factory job. You're not going to be unionized, whereas you probably were at the factory. It's also replaced retail work, and to the extent that brick and mortar retail work is just vanishing, but it's far more physically taxing than retail work was. Being a retail clerk at a department store was a much less grueling, much less isolating kind of work than the warehouse work is. So it's kind of we have this new form of mass work that is caught in the middle, where it's both more physically strenuous than the retail jobs that it's kind of replaced, but it's also less well-paying and less kind of purposeful than a lot of the factory work that it has come to resemble. So that is kind of what the film captures. Although I do think it was the Amazon segments were a little bit too mild.
And what do you see then in the workers themselves? Are they more apt to be attracted to a populist sort of politician then? I mean, they voted down a union that seems like a conservative position. So is that going to continue to be seen in our elections?
The vote against the union, I think, we have to keep some things in mind, that sort of what I mentioned earlier about the tough odds, the fact that the way our labor laws are now, these elections are run in such a kind of slanted way where the employer has essentially unfettered access to deliver a very strong anti-union message in the weeks prior to the election, whereas the union itself is much harder for them to reach workers, especially this year, because with the pandemic, they weren't even making house calls to vote to workers, which might have been a mistake. And then on top of that, you have the broader problem of just the real the diminished expectations among workers now, where a lot of workers, think, I'm just doing this job for a while. It pays $15. That's better than nothing. It's better than fast food. I don't plan on doing it for very long. You don't even know anyone maybe who's been in a union who sort of shows you the example of what more you could expect with more say in the job and more voice. So I think those are some of those factors go into that no vote. But as far as the politics go, I mean, absolutely. I mean, one big reason I wanted to write this book was the 2016 election, because I really do see these regional disparities that my book is about. My book started out being about regional disparities, not about Amazon. I wanted to write about these incredible growing divides in our country, and I settled on Amazon as the frame to tell that story. But I absolutely believe that those regional disparities have played a big role in our politics. They played a role in Trump's election. They've played a role in just all in this sort of growing kind of alienation. People out in struggling towns and cities that look to our sort of winner take all cities that are mostly on the coast and feel real resentment over it and real disconnect from that. And then by the same token, people in the winter cities that are growing more and more sort of detached from what's actually happening out there. And And so that absolutely is, it's a real, as the panel's theme says, these divides are rooted in real things that are happening around the country, and one of those things is this. One of it is, a big part of it is what Tom's been writing about, which is what's been happening in rural America, partly because of what's been happening in agriculture, but it's also what's happening in these towns and cities that are not even necessarily rural America, but are feeling just this incredible left behindness, as they watch the big Seattle and DC's kind of pull away from them.
Tom, during the first question, you kept saying soon. It's going to happen soon, and it's scary. So what's the worst case scenario, and how soon? I mean, can we see what you're writing about very real to all of us around the country, perhaps not to just the Central California paying more and more for water, but how will these potential events right in our grocery store further divide or unite us?
Wow, I think it's really hard to say what is meant by soon. I have a character in the book, a fantastic soil scientist at Iowa State University named Richard Cruz, who's kind of, really the great source on soil erosion in the Midwest, and just how it's so much faster than what the USDA's numbers are coming up with. And I put the question to him, and I said, we're out here in this field, and you're showing me an example of what you're talking about. We're looking out into the field and seeing these patches in the late spring where this incredible black soil, and then there's these patches everywhere where the soil is more of a kind of a gray, and those are the places where topsoil has eroded from, and they're getting bigger and bigger. Just a big study that came out from some scientists up in the Northeast about Iowa, looking at satellite imagery and showing that this erosion problem is happening before our eyes very, very rapidly. And I said, when does this just collapse? And basically what it is a system that is getting more and more fragile. Topsoil, having a great sort of topsoil gives you a very robust food system because, high quality topsoil can withstand droughts better. It holds water better. It stays in place better if there's a flood. And it produces higher yields. You need fewer chemicals to get higher yields from it. And what's happening is that our system is getting more and more fragile. And this same phenomenon that's happening in California is getting more and more fragile, even as the shocks that we know are coming are getting more and more severe. We're going to get more severe summer storms in the Midwest, more severe droughts. This is coming because of climate change. The trends are already there, documented, it's accelerating. And so when we need to be making our food system more resilient, we're actually making it more fragile. And there's a line from someone about, I think it's a Hemingway line about, how did you lose your fortune? Well, it happened gradually and then suddenly. And I think that's what we're looking at here is, we have this situation continues and continues. We get more and more topsoil loss. And then a 100-year drought hits the Midwest, and we get, essentially, because this thin topsoil doesn't hold water well, and there's no irrigation in the Midwest, you get a severely damaged, reduced corn and soybean crop, and then that ripples. And that actually happened in 2012. There was a massive drought in the Midwest that caused huge yield losses. But there had been big harvests before that, so there was stocks left over, and it did cause food prices to spike. And those spikes didn't hit American consumers too hard, but in the global South, they caused, basically that event in the Midwest is one of the triggers for the Arab Spring because it caused a spike in commodity prices worldwide. And when that happens, we don't feel it as much in the United States because
Mm-hmm.
most of what we eat is so processed, and the corn and soybeans are the price of them is a rather small part of the final price. But in the global South, oftentimes people are directly eating these commodities, and so when the price goes up 40%, and people are living on low incomes, you get a spike in hunger and starvation, and that's exactly what happened. And that's the kind of thing that we're looking at going forward. And so I can't put a time frame on it. I can tell you that it would be a really good idea to start reversing that process right now.
Okay. Boy, Tom, how do you sleep at night?
I don't sleep very well, actually.
Oh,
I'm not
God.
I'm not a great sleeper.
What are you growing? Are you growing anything in your in your backyard now?
You know, I'm living in a place right now that is very shady, and so I do have some herbs. I've got some herbs going, but
Okay.
I'm
All right.
definitely missing access to a sunny spot to grow some stuff.
Sugar. Okay, Alec, fulfillment zeroes in on Amazon, but tell us how it's also part of a broader economic, political, cultural landscape, and how that will continue to divide us. How do you predict that that's going to play out?
Sure. I mean, what the book describes is this landscape, this national landscape, where we're essentially separating into kind of what I call winner-take-all cities and left-behind cities, and that's happening, and that's very much tied to Amazon and the other tech giants, because one reason we're ending up with this regional concentration of wealth is that we have such economic concentration within our economy, within certain markets, within certain sectors, including agriculture, as Tom has mentioned. You have just this incredible concentration within agriculture, which is such a huge problem for small farmers who have to basically sell to these handful of giants, but in tech it's an especially consequential problem in tech, because it means that we've ended up with just a handful of cities like Seattle that are now or the Bay Area that are now just have absorbed so much of the nation's wealth and business activity because they're home to these giants. I mean, look at what's happened with my industry of the news media. You have essentially now money and business activity, commerce that used to be all around the country, ad revenue that used to be all around the country, is now flowing to just two companies, Google and Facebook, that control 60% of all digital ad revenue, which is now the kind of lifeblood of the industry. And they're in San Francisco, and so you end up with these dystopian levels of wealth and inequality in San Francisco. Retail, you have more than 40% flowing to one company, Amazon, at a time when e-commerce is growing bigger and bigger, and you have all that commerce and business activity that used to be spread around the country flowing to Seattle, and now also Washington D.C., which will be their second headquarters. So you end up with this really unhealthy disparities between places. And what the book suggests is that it's terrible for both sorts of places, because it's obviously not good for the left behind places that are dealing with blight and abandonment and sadness and resentment. But it's also not good for the winner take all places. They're dealing with just these dystopian levels of inequality and homelessness and unaffordability and displacement and loss of character. And so we're all kind of out of whack in a way. And because we've let our geography get so out of balance, partly because we've let these giants get so big. And that out of whackness does have a cultural aspect to it. It's that we've become we're so in our own bubbles now, and the bubbles have gotten so intensely really just unrecognizable to the other, because the divides have just gotten so big, the economic divides have gotten so big that we really become complete strangers to each other. And I've really see the book, and also I've seen a lot of my articles these last few years as an attempt to essentially create some kind of better understanding between the two sides, because they are just so enormously distant. And I've really come to see myself as a bit of an emissary between them.
Yes, I think a lot of journalists see that every day in their inbox when the story they write gets such vastly different reactions from people whose experience is so different from that of the other. Hey, Tom, you write about the promise of regional farming or dispersed farming as a potential remedy. Talk about that and how that has been received by farmers and others, and whether they view it as you're crazy or perhaps there's something to be said there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to a theme I was just mentioning about how because of climate change, we are in for a bunch of shocks going forward. We know that the freak storms that just, hit Central Texas a while back, utterly inconceivable what happened in Central Texas. As someone who grew up there, well, the inconceivable is now becoming routine. I mean, so we know that this sort of thing is gonna be happening, and the way that I think about sort of regionalizing and relocalizing food production is that it just goes back to the theme of making our society and our food system more resilient. And that is to say, like, basically, I can document that California's food production is going to decline because of the factors I discussed in the book. But that doesn't mean California is going to stop producing food, because it's an incredible place to grow food. It's in a Mediterranean climate. It does have some pretty good water resources for a Mediterranean climate in this giant mountain range that goes along its eastern edge. So it's always going to be there producing food on some level, but we don't have to rely on it quite so much, right? We don't have to go, if you look at the list of, percentages that come from California of stuff like broccoli and lettuce and, just so many different products that we're so used to having year round. California doesn't have to be the dominant supplier of them. And what we can do is create redundancy. And we can build up food production in other areas. And basically we have seen a movement in the past 25 years to do just that. Farmers markets in Central Texas are, way bigger than they were when I was a little kid.
It's true. They're so fabulous everywhere.
Yeah, but it's still producing a fairly tiny fraction. It's still really seasonally based. And so what I envision is all these different regions getting together and using policy to figure out how they can invest in local regional food production, scale it up, make it cheaper, make it a decent paying job, not relying on exploited workers to be the sort of harvesters and to do the actual work on the ground, and create a system that as California sort of adjusts to its new water reality and its new regulatory reality, we have a more robust dispersed system all over the country. And that, that way you get something like when you get one of these climate disasters, a giant hurricane blowing through a key growing area, we're diversified. There's food that can be moved around. So I'm not calling for the end of food trade or the end of even national food trade, but I just want to see more redundancy in the system, because we know that we're going to need it going forward. And I think that, I would say that farmers who grow for farmers markets and grow for local markets across the country, really this message resonates with them, because there is this sort of go it alone assumption we have for farms in this country. It's this individualistic, a farmer out in his little patch of land or her patch of land growing food for people, and it's isolating. It's incredibly tough business. Land prices are really high near cities. It's a really difficult profession, and despite all the progress we made in the past 20 years, it's actually getting harder and harder, and people want policy in place. They want The federal government spends between last year, $46 billion propping up industrial scale food production. And let's get some of that support and policy behind the kind of food production that we actually need. And so, yeah, this message resonates. People who grow high quality food for a local market are exhausted by how difficult the job is and would like to see some support, I think.
And perhaps people will be more understanding or cognizant of this if, unfortunately, if food prices go up. I mean, is that part of this reality, and when we'll wake up to it?
I think so. And I think that there is this false sense of security that we have that, the stuff that Tom is writing about in his book, it's awful, but we're a modern capitalist economy, and if we can no longer produce food here because of these ecological factors that he's talking about, well, let's just import it from somewhere else, right?
Right.
It's just, and we're actually already doing that. We've seen a steady rise in fruits and vegetable imports in the past 20 years. A lot of it based on economic decisions being made in California that go into like the sort of expansion of the almond industry, sort of squeezing out fruits and vegetable production at the margins, and that fruit and vegetable production going south to Mexico. And the message that I have about that is that the areas that we want to import from, that we are importing from, places like Mexico, Baja California, just below California, or other areas in Mexico, have the same ecological problems that we're talking about here. Oftentimes they, share a border. And so the same water scarcity issues, if we shift our reliance more south to Mexico, now we're dealing with the same issues, but in Mexico. And, it's the same in places like Chile. And we also see Europe moving, getting more and more fruits and vegetables from, countries in Africa. But all those places are dealing with the same climate issues. And then you also get justice issues, like how are you going to import food from a country with high levels of poverty and hunger, and you're using the best land in that country to grow food for the United States? That doesn't make a lot of sense either. And but basically the message of one of the messages of my book is that we can't import our way out of this. And eventually, if things don't change pretty fast, we are going to see, we've had several generations of Americans now used to having very low cost food. And that's going to change definitely if these problems aren't addressed, and food is going to get a lot more expensive. And, one of the reasons why the economy that Alec has so beautifully described here, one of the reasons why the sort of ruling class in this country can get away with that is because food is so cheap. We pay a very low percentage of our income on for food in this country because of exploitative wages and all these costs that I document in my book that are taken off the balance sheets of these companies. And so we get this really cheap food supply, and that, if you're Amazon and relying on a giant workforce making $15 an hour, you want your employees to be able to go into McDonald's and get a $2 hamburger. But what I'm here to tell you is that's not going to be here for very much longer if the climate change proceeds apace without big changes. And so overlaying the crisis that Alec is writing about with the crisis that I'm writing about, you get a recipe for a lot of social unrest going forward.
Exactly. And then when you think of how Walmart is another giant in allowing us to buy the cheapest articles of clothing or equipment that we need in our kitchen, it all is exacerbated.
Or tomatoes from Mexico.
Or tomatoes from Mexico.
Yeah.
And then, well, there's just so many ways in which we're sort of living in this a vision of abundance that isn't real, that won't be real for a very long time. Okay, Alec, your book focuses on how Amazon has exacerbated regional inequality. Give us an example, one that stays with you from somewhere in the country where you saw that, perhaps in your own childhood home or a place that you really care about.
Sure. I mean, the kind of contrast between a winner-take-all city and a left-behind one that really kind of sits at the core of the book, is very personal to me, is actually Washington and Baltimore. I live in Baltimore, and but I've lived in Washington also these last 20 years. I've kind of moved between the two cities quite a bit, and I've just seen this gap between two cities that were used to be very similar in size and actually quite similar in wealth, growing just wildly apart to the point where now it's just, to travel between them just an hour on the train is really surreal, because they're just have such extraordinarily different prospects and prosperity. You know, it's almost like a change in atmospheric pressure when you go from one to the other. You get dizzy almost. It's crazy how apart they've grown, and it's completely unhealthy again for both sides, because in DC you have people struggling to afford homes. 20,000 Black residents displaced from DC just in the last decade or so, according to one study. Row houses cost $700,000, $800,000, $900,000, $1 million. Meanwhile, up in Baltimore, the exact same houses are being demolished by the hundreds, by the thousands, because they're, you know, just massive blight and vacancy, and that just makes no sense. It makes no sense at either end. And Amazon's exacerbating this because in its recent decision to place its second headquarters in Washington, D.C. It could have placed that second headquarters in any number of the left-behind cities like Baltimore, or like St. Louis, or like Cleveland, and made at least some difference there in rebalancing kind of regional prosperity in America. But instead, they chose to put the second headquarters in the wealthiest city in the country. Washington, D.C. is home to 5 or 6 of the 10 wealthiest counties in the country. And so you're going to just, it's a rich get richer effect, winner take all effect. It's going to get even more extreme, that gap. And they chose to put it in Washington, of course, both because there was already a big kind of tech workforce there for them to draw on, but also because they wanted to be close to the seat of federal power, because there's a big fight coming over antitrust now and trying to rein in some of these giants. And they know that being in Washington will help their cause. Meanwhile, Baltimore, we just got our third warehouse here in town. We've now got 3 huge warehouses. 2 of them in an exact same spot as a former steel mill. The largest steel works in the country in the 1950s is now a warehouse business park where workers are making less than half what they made at the steel mill, and packaging stuff made in China instead of making something here in America. And I tell the story in the book of that transformation of this one place from a steel mill into warehouses, and then also the story of that growing gap. And it's so unhealthy, and it's terrible. It's terrible for both places. We can't go on having things get that out of whack. But in the case of Baltimore and Washington, it's only going to get more out of whack now. You're going to have headquarters town, you have headquarters city and warehouse towns now. That's where we're headed.
Which gets back to the divisiveness between voters and people who don't understand one another. Okay, Tom, one of the subjects that I've written a lot about over the years in my journalism career are farm workers, and how much that movement has meant to a greater number of people, because they see themselves and their parents and grandparents in that industry. What about farm workers? How are they doing in these agricultural areas, and what impact will these potential shifts that you see make on them? And we're getting close to the end of the session. We have 5 more minutes, so let's give you another 3, and then we'll wrap it up with some comments from each of you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a devastating time, I have to say, because one thing you're seeing, I mean, this is really kind of about the power of global capitalism, because in California, which is the state that has the most farm workers, it's the state where there's the most where agriculture hasn't been able to mechanize out handwork in a lot of the agriculture that brings our fruits and vegetables to the table, and that's where they come from. And California is, because of progressive movements, because of work of groups like the United Farm Workers and other social movements, California is bringing farm work into the middle part of the 20th century. And what I mean by that is farm labor was excluded from laws like minimum wages and time and a half overtime. The sort of labor movement's great victories as part of compromises that were made, farm labor was left out of that. And so California is doing something about that. It is imposing, you have to pay someone time and a half if they work overtime on your farm. And what that is doing is it's creating a massive push to mechanize and to switch into things like almonds, which are mechanized, and they're high investment at first, but you can make a lot of money on them, and they have very low labor costs. And the more hand labor of kinds of products that were grown in California forever, like asparagus, like artichokes, lots of other stuff, is moving south to Mexico, where they have lower labor standards. And so farm workers in the Central Valley of California are feeling that squeeze. Their bosses are doing their very, very best to make them, redundant. And then in the meantime, those areas are incredible. The air is terrible, the water is terrible. And so I think the same kinds of social movements that saw the push to unionize that Amazon warehouse in Alabama, those same sorts of social movements are working in places like California. And I think what we're going to have to see is trans-border organizing, farm workers in places like Mexico organizing with farm workers north of the border. And I think we're already starting to see that. Capital is globalized. And so I think labor has to globalize too.
That's fascinating. We just have 3 more minutes. So first of all, I want to thank you and thank the book festival. One of the things I always tell young aspiring journalists and writers is that good writers are good readers, and you weren't able to enjoy the festival firsthand, but I can tell you it's so beautiful and so inspiring to see young readers and middle-aged readers and college readers and elderly readers all together under the same tent. So we just have 2 minutes, so I'll give you each a minute to wrap things up and just say goodbye. Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, go ahead, Tom.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Alec. It's your turn anyway, so let's do that.
No, thank you so much. And you're absolutely right about reading. I often tell young reporters who I'm mentoring or talking to that one of the most important things they can do is to read more. Read more everything, read more books, read more newspapers, read more magazines, because you learn how to do it by reading, and you also draw connections between things when you're reading. And the last thing I would just say real quickly is that one thing I think my book hopefully leaves people with is the sense of the importance that we now, after this awful pandemic, as we're coming out of it, that we really kind of re-engage with the world around us. It's not just with our shopping habits, but just in general, getting out into the communities where we live, getting back to the theater, getting back to things we care about, the movies, the things that make our places places that we care about. So I'm just going to leave it with that message, because that's really, I think, what sort of stands before us at this moment.
That's beautiful.
I'll just say
Tom.
Really briefly that I think both my book and Alex's book really illustrate the need for solidarity going forward. When you get out there, as Alex says, and back out into the community, remember that we're all in this together. We have massive challenges from climate change and from various economic dysfunctions we have in society, and the only answer for them is solidarity with people, you know, who are different than you, who you're connected to through these commodity chains. Like you're connected to a worker when you get an Amazon worker in a warehouse, when you get a book from Amazon. You're connected to a farm worker when you eat something, and show solidarity with, figure out ways to show solidarity with those people is how I'm going to leave it.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to talk with you guys. Reed, thank you, everybody. Goodbye. Have a great Sunday.
Thank you.
Thanks.